Hey there, I'm Damien from Game Innovator, and today we shall be having a look at the Australia-China Free Trade Agreement. We'll just be taking a very quick look. In case if you don't know what a free trade agreement is, it is essentially a fantasy being peddled by the mainstream media in your respective country most of the time. Essentially, they're very exploitative agreements the vast majority of the time. One country benefits massively and can sometimes even lead to a bit of an economic takeover of another country, or at the very least, would lead to a much worse, basically a much worse trading position overall for one country. Compared to the other in the deal. So, yeah, usually they're very, very, very unequal treaties. But yeah, I mean, if you have a look at the Australia-United States Free Trade Agreement, for example, essentially the country did not benefit at all from that. Australia, that is. The only real thing we saw from that was adopting American laws and a rising trade deficit against the US, which none of which has really been particularly good for us, especially the copyright laws. But there you go. Nonetheless, our leaders have saw fit to agree to a free trade agreement between Australia and China, and we'll just have a look at what that actually means. So, just the gist of it essentially, because obviously the actual agreement is pretty freaking long, but essentially what Australia gets is some tariff reductions as well as the ability to do very, very limited and very restricted business in China. And basically, for that, for those scraps, what we have to give to the Chinese is the biggest thing, of course, would be the ISDS. That's the Investor State Dispute Resolution Agreement. Investor State Dispute Settlement Agreement. God, I even got the fucking acronym wrong. Well, there's so many to fucking remember. But anyway, so that basically means that, technically Australian companies can, for example, sue the Chinese government, for adopting policies that adversely affect their interests, but Chinese companies can do the same thing to the Australian government. And, obviously, doesn't take a genius to see how bloody unequal that is, because, let's just face it, Australian companies are pretty pathetic compared to their US counterparts or Chinese counterparts for that matter. So basically, this is going to open the floodgates for Chinese companies to really sue the shit out of us for for various laws, regulations, that sort of stuff that we try to enact that God forbid actually protects our national interests, whether it be society, environment, our own businesses, etc., etc. So yeah, that's great. We're going to be giving that way to the Chinese, essentially, for not being able to do much ourselves in terms of suing their government for using our businesses. And apart from that, we also will allow Chinese investors to, let's have a look. Yes, they'll be able to invest up. Well, it was from 252 million originally to 1,094 million, presumably Australian dollars. Those are the investments they'll be able to make in non-sensitive sectors, and that would be the new threshold. And above that, the Foreign Investment Review Board will screen stuff it's bigger than that, essentially. Hopefully I put that correctly. So basically increases the threshold for how much individual investments can be before they actually get investigated for non-sensitive sectors, but still. And apart from that, Chinese investors who invest in projects over 150 million Australian, presumably, will also get additional rights to bring in migrant workers without testing the local labour market. So basically, without having to check whether there are local skilled workers that they need. Instead, they'll just be able to import, either their own labour or, cheap labour from somewhere else. So that's something we cannot do in China, on the other hand, though. So very one-sided agreement by the looks of things. And really, even if you look at it, those non-sensitive sectors, they apparently include stuff like agriculture, telecoms, defense, of course, media, that sort of stuff. I mean, that's all well and good, but our current safeguards that we have in place are pretty poor, to say the least. We've had foreign companies, especially Asian ones in general, and including Chinese ones, they've already been buying out Australian residential properties as well as various commercial interests. In fact, recently we've actually sold our our biggest food manufacturer in the country. We actually sold that off to a pair of Asian companies. Can't remember their names, unfortunately, but if you do a search for it, you should be able to find it. So, yeah, we're kind of selling out majorly, and it looks like that's just going to accelerate under this so-called free trade agreement. But, yeah, it should be interesting to see what will happen there. So there we go, just my 2 cents on what's happening. I mean, who knows? Maybe everything will work perfectly out for Australia as a country due to this agreement, but honestly, I doubt it. It's a very, very exploitative free trade agreement from what I've seen, and well, I'm kind of surprised that our politicians agree to that, really. But what the hell? I suppose we'll just have to see. We'll just see what history will tell of this momentous occasion, whether we'll get screwed like we did in the US-Australia Free Trade Agreement, or whether some miracle will happen. But there you have it. One thing's for sure, we're certainly living in interesting times. So, see you next time.